Hey there, welcome back for the Chapter 2 installment of The Great Gatsby. I'm going to get right into it. So if we take a look at our map of New York City here, just recall that over here is East Egg, over here is West Egg, right here is the Valley of Ashes, and here is New York City, Manhattan Island. All right, so as we make our way into Chapter 2, things begin here in the Valley of Ashes. We find out that Nick and Tom are together, and Nick talks a little bit about taking the commuter train. We are also told that it's a few days before the 4th of July. So just remember that in Chapter 1, basically, Nick is telling us everything after the fact, but when he starts to go back in time, just remember that he moved out east in the spring of 1922. So, and we find out that he went to have dinner with the Buchanans shortly after his move. We don't get a lot of information, if he moved there, let's say in April, we don't get a lot of information about what happened in the intervening months. But I would imagine that he's settling in, he's getting to know the people that inhabit this story. And more than anything, he's probably just studying and working in the bonds business. All right, but in Chapter 2, I'm going to get into a more extensive description of the Valley of Ashes. But after they pass through that, they end up in Manhattan. And more specifically, I know I drew a star here, but this pinpoint here, if I zoom in, and it'll mess things up, but if I zoom in, you'd find out that the Upper West Side is here, Harlem is here, Washington Heights is up here. And so this little residence, or this place where they spend the afternoon, has a French name called a pied à terre. And I apologize if my pronunciation isn't great. It's been a long time since I've taken French, but literally translated, those of you who've taken French, you know that the term pied describes foot, and that terre is earth or the ground. So this term pied à terre refers to a secondary kind of residence that you might have that's used more for just temporary lodging. So for the extremely wealthy, and that was true then and it's true now in New York City, if you have the kind of money just to have a secondary piece of real estate, you might live out in a place like the Hamptons, Long Island, or you might live in Westchester County, which is north of Manhattan. And you might just keep this like secondary crash pad where, let's say you wanted to go into the city for a weekend and, go catch a Broadway show and things end late and you don't want to take the train or drive back out to the suburbs. Well, you've got a place in the city. So what we need to keep in mind is that in my text, it's at the bottom of page 28. You can probably find it relatively easily in your PDF text. But Nick tells us we went on cutting back again over the park, that's Central Park, toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. So this just kind of positions you to know where they are. Tom owns this property. Of course, he's the only one in Chapter 2 that would have the means to do so. Probably affords him with an easy place to carry out his affairs because, of course, Daisy is not working. She has no reason to be in Manhattan unless she's with Tom, and so she's all the way out in Long Island, clueless. Not really clueless, though, but pretending to be clueless. So that just kind of helps spell that out. Now we'll get into the text here. At the beginning of Chapter 2, some things to take away that are important. You definitely need to know that the Valley of Ashes is marked by its desolation. If we were to do a study of the diction, you can pretty easily see the words that are helping to position us and make us feel a certain way about this place. Talks about grotesque gardens. Ashes take the form of houses and chimneys. There's rising smoke. The men are moving about dimly. They're already crumbling. The air is powdery. There are gray cars. There's Ghastly Creek as the train crawls along on the track. There are these ash gray men. There's impenetrable clouds. It's screening their obscure operations. And if we go on, gray land, spasms of bleak dust. So when you take that collection of terms together, you can see that this place is characterized by a sense of lifelessness, filth, dust, smoke. I don't want to call it a hell per se, but certainly it's not a place where you'd want to spend any extensive period of time. All right, it's marked by its pollution. And so what this communicates to us, this hopelessness, this lifelessness, is that there is a byproduct to capitalism. There is a side effect to this relentless pursuit of material wealth and the American dream. You've got to dump the pollution somewhere, and here's where it gets dumped. And it's no accident that the Wilsons live here, because if you were to construct some kind of visual representation of the haves versus the have-nots, we can see that George and Myrtle are living in poverty. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is that it's not accidental that Tom and Myrtle first meet in this space. I think there's a sense of moral decay and laxity here. There's a kind of godlessness, and so their affair is going to begin there. Now, at this point in time, we have every indication that despite this being a kind of godless place, George right now seems like a man of integrity, seems like he is working as hard as he can, and he's doing the best he can to take care of his wife and to stay afloat, but he's really struggling. All right, I want to move to the bottom of page 26 here. We get our first introduction to Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. This is a symbol, so you definitely want to collect information about it and think about how you might interpret what this all means. Sometimes when I've taught this work before, people don't get it. Initially, they don't understand what's being talked about here, but it tells us that above the gray land and the spasms of the dust, you perceive the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. And we are told that they're blue and gigantic, that the retinas are 1 yard high. These eyes peer out from behind a pair of yellow spectacles. So we get that sense right here. But there's a disembodied face, so you don't really know exactly what Eckleburg or whoever's being depicted in this image, who it is. It's just the eyes and the spectacles. Nick assumes that this is the work of an oculist, and an oculist is an eye doctor. And it says, evidently some wild wagon oculist set them there to fatten his practice. So if we're talking about fattening your practice and we're talking about an eye doctor, what you can conclude or infer is that he's talking about a billboard or some type of advertisement that's overlooking this desolate space of land. And I think it's not accidental. We find out that this billboard, if you want to call it that, has been neglected. It's sat out under many paintless days of sun and rain. And it's there, not cared for, probably because either this oculist, his business failed, or he moved away and didn't bother to take this down. We find out that these eyes brood on over the solemn dumping ground. So that's important too, because as you start to think about what the symbol could mean, we get the sense that these characters don't really have much God or much faith in their lives, and that instead the only kind of presence watching over this space is an advertisement. So that tells us something, right? It might tell us that perhaps these people have replaced God with a pursuit of that material wealth, or that God has been replaced by this pursuit of the American dream, which for these people, faith is not something that's being prioritized in getting that American dream. And you can see what results, right? Desolation. All right, here is where Nick tells us that it's in the Valley of Ashes that he first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. Tom is pretty open about the fact that he has a mistress, but he doesn't do it openly um, on East Egg. He waits until he goes to New York to carry out that affair. Okay, kind of important because we get the introduction to a new character. Here we're told that George Wilson, who's the mechanic at the shop that he owns, we're told that he's blonde, spiritless, anemic, which means he doesn't have enough iron in his blood, and so sometimes that might be characterized by weakness, pale skin, and yet he's still faintly handsome. You can see that there's just a damp gleam of hope springing into his eyes, and that's precipitated by Tom, who kind of dangles this promise of business in front of George. And we find that out because Wilson says, I can't complain unconvincingly. So we get the impression his business is really struggling. He's barely making ends meet, not making ends meet, really. And he says to Tom, when are you going to sell me that car? So we can infer that Tom has been here in the past and that the two have had a conversation about some potential for business here. But keep in mind, Tom is just using this as a ruse. It's a pretext for him. Not to say that he could sell George a car. I mean, money's not an object for him. But really, this is a pretext for finding a way to meet up with Myrtle. And so as you think about Tom and George and the relationship between these two that exists, I like to think of Tom as sort of a puppet master controlling George, his puppet, or it's almost like Tom is a pet owner dangling a little treat in front of his dog. And so you can see the ways in which he utilizes his physical strength, his dominance, his privilege, his wealth to be the one in control here. Okay, at the bottom of page 28, I love the way Myrtle is introduced because even though she is voluptuous, we're told that she has a thickish figure. We're told that she's in her middle 30s. She's faintly stout, but she carries her surplus sensuously, as some women can. Okay. Her clothing, according to Nick at least, doesn't really have much beauty in it. But we're told that she has an immediately perceptible vitality about her, and it's like she's continually smoldering. So if you were to put Daisy and Myrtle side by side, even the names in this text have symbolic value. Daisy, of course, is a flower. It's white. First time Daisy's mentioned, you can see that she's wearing white clothing. She talks about passing her white childhood in Louisville. And a lot of times symbolically, when we see that mention of white, we might think of innocence or purity. Not saying that's actually true, but certainly Daisy gives us that illusion on the surface that she's pure and that she's innocent and that she's fragile. She's a beautiful little fool. And daisies, you've probably seen them. They've got those little white petals with the yellow center. In stark contrast, Myrtle is something we see a lot around here, but it's just a green leafy plant. It doesn't have the kind of fragility or the kind of femininity or the kind of beauty. But even though I picture Daisy as being kind of thin and a little bit waifish, and she's depicted that way in the film adaptations as well, Myrtle is thick, but she's sensual. She's got this smoldering sexual presence. And so you can see that she and Daisy are about as different as it gets in terms of, both their physical appearance and the way they conduct themselves. But Tom is drawn to this. At least from when I talk about Tom's attraction to Myrtle, it's pretty clear that it's just physical and sexual in nature. I don't think that he has like a legitimate care or concern for her as a person. Okay, so Tom and Myrtle ask George to go get some chairs, and while he's in the other room, Tom and Myrtle make some plans to meet up in the city. It's interesting, in the past when I taught this in IB English, one of my students did an entire 15-minute presentation on the role of fashion and the clothing that makes an appearance in the novel. You'll notice right here, Myrtle was in a blue crepe de chine dress. Now she changes to a brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips. So she's changed in order to go to New York City, and you're going to see she actually undergoes one more costume change before this chapter ends. I think that part of what she's doing is undergoing a transformation, at least externally, as she conducts this affair, right? Being with Tom gives her, I think, this fantasy, and she believes in it wholeheartedly. She thinks that Tom is going to leave Daisy and they're going to move away. They're going to move out west. But of course, that's naive. Tom is never going to leave someone like Daisy because, as we'll find out, they're pretty perfectly matched because their wealth unites them. But Myrtle is carrying out this fantasy. Tom gives her access to material wealth, which she clearly does not have in her union with George. And so moving on, we just kind of see this passage where Tom enables her to buy all of these things she wants. She sees this man with a basket of puppies. She wants a dog. I'm sure she has no real thoughts about the responsibility it'll take to actually take care of that long term. But Tom buys her this dog. Okay, and then they head over to their apartment. Well, Tom's, crash pad. Here, if you really want to dissect the language, you can find out, I think part of what Fitzgerald is doing is to communicate that maybe Myrtle had some hand in decorating this place, because it says the furniture's too large for it. There's some just like tacky interior design. Certainly doesn't have the kind of elegance that Tom would have in his East Egg mansion. So maybe he let Myrtle decorate. We do find out right here that Nick is drunk. He says, I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it. So that could negatively impact his reliability as a narrator. He just talks about people coming and going. We learn about Myrtle's sister, Catherine. And it says she came in with a proprietary haste. If you're the proprietor, you are the owner. But I don't want you to get the mistaken assumption that Catherine owns this place. It's not hers. Nick says she looked around possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. So I don't know, maybe Myrtle gave her a key or something. It's hard to say, but I believe that it's Tom's place. Okay, we learn about the McKees, the guests that spend the afternoon with them. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man. Mrs. McKee, we're told, is shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. So Nick does not like her at all. And through this, really, we're getting the sense that, filtered through Nick's perspective, he does kind of operate in margins of the upper middle class. And so he sees these people as lacking taste. He doesn't really enjoy the time he's spending with the Wilson girls or with the McKees. Here, we're told that Mrs. Wilson changes into her third costume. I think it's not accidental that it's cream colored, because I'll talk more about colors later. It says her personality had undergone a change, and she has this hauteur now, which means arrogance. So again, she's thinking that because Tom buys her all of these things, it also gives her access to climb that socioeconomic ladder and bring her that much closer to her American dream. Of course, she's thrown her morality out of the window because she's cheating on her husband. So I think Fitzgerald is making a comment here that, yes, you can make your way to the top of that ladder, but it's going to come at a cost. And that cost is probably going to be your morality. Because as we've seen, well, we haven't seen it with everybody yet. We don't know a whole lot about some of the characters, but we can certainly see it with Tom. He's at the top of that ladder and he's thrown his morality away. Myrtle, to try to get to the top of that ladder, has thrown her morality away. George is at the bottom of the ladder, but he's got his morality intact. And Nick, hard to say. I look at him as an insider and an outsider. You know, he likes to pretend to us like he's on some higher plane of his morality, but I would say he's complicit. He's kind of a partner in all of this. For example, he sees that Tom is carrying on the affair, but he doesn't really say anything to Daisy. Now, he could argue that, well, Daisy already knows about it, so why would I need to say anything? But still, it's just kind of slimy. All right, here we see Myrtle openly talking about money and how much this bill cost. That's tacky because people who are of old money don't really talk explicitly or openly about how much things cost. So that shows us that, you know, that Myrtle and Tom are of two really different backgrounds. Here, Myrtle pretends like this dress she has on is just an old rag when it's not. You know that Tom is buying all of this for her and she's showing off by continually changing her outfits. We get some really valuable information here as Nick and Catherine talk about this affair between Tom and Myrtle. Catherine says neither of them can stand the person that they're married to, and she says they can't stand them. Well, for Myrtle, she makes it clear in this chapter that she thinks George is beneath her, that initially she thought he was a nice guy, and so she married him. But it's clear that Myrtle is looking for someone who has money, that's of, you know, pretty strong importance to her. So, and then as far as why Tom can't stand Daisy, this is where things get a little bit interesting because Catherine says here, well, the reason why Tom and Myrtle can't be together is because Daisy's a Catholic. And of course, we know that divorce is frowned upon within the Catholic Church. So, you know, that's what's being said here. Now, Daisy's actually not Catholic. And Nick tells us here, I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. So what it reveals to us is that Tom has lied to Myrtle. He's told Myrtle, Daisy will not let me get a divorce because she's Catholic. That's a lie. Okay, there's something else that keeps Tom and Daisy together. And I'll let you speculate about what that might be. Even though they're not happy together, or at least it would appear that way if Tom has gone off to have an affair. And yeah, I mean, you can obviously there's a fracture in the relationship if he's doing that, but there's something that keeps him with Daisy. He would never leave Daisy for someone like Myrtle, like permanently. He would never leave Daisy to marry Myrtle. But he's convinced Myrtle that he would leave Daisy just so that he can continue to conduct this affair for as long as it suits him. And then, as I'm sure you might already imagine, when he's done with her, he'll toss her out like she's a piece of trash. We get mentioned here that the late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean. I'm just calling your attention to that word blue, because Fitzgerald, keep wanting to say Shakespeare, I think, as I'm doing Romeo and Juliet with freshmen. Fitzgerald's doing something with that color of blue. Ay, ay, ay. Okay, now Mrs. McKee here talks about how she almost married I don't even want to say the word, a little kike who had been after me for years. It's spelled strangely here because usually you'll see it spelled Kike, but it is an extremely offensive and disparaging term that describes someone who is Jewish. So that tells us, we see in this work certainly moments of anti-Semitism. You're going to see it again with a character named Meyer Wolfsheim. That was, I think, a pretty normal sentiment, before World War II. Even within the United States, certainly there was no Holocaust going on here, but there were people who had anti-Semitic values and felt open to express them. And you can see Mrs. McKee doing it here. And she says, everybody kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. And Myrtle says, at least you didn't marry him. That's the difference between your case and mine. And then Myrtle says here about George, I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. So again, she thinks that George is beneath her, but she still married him. Because initially, apparently, she was crazy about him, although she denies it. Okay. I really love Fitzgerald's line here. Nick tells us, I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. So just as we're thinking about rhetoric and reviewing those terms, we have great antithesis here because we have an opposition of contrasting ideas paired together in parallel structure. We have the within versus the without. We have the enchanted versus repelled. And so Nick, always, he's kind of in an ambivalent position. He's on the inside, but he's on the outside. He's accepted by them, but he doesn't totally feel like he's one of them. He's both enchanted by what he witnesses, but he's also repulsed by it. And so I think that's valuable just in terms of understanding him as a narrator, as he's kind of a complicated figure. Okay, and so basically they conduct this party into the wee hours. It's after midnight. Oh, this part is important. We see that Myrtle feels like she can say Daisy's name and she starts saying it. And we can see here Tom's capacity for violence. He breaks open her nose with his open hand. He just made a short, deft movement, backhanded her, and broke her nose in the process. And so we see a lot of commotion and bloody towels. In chapter 1, Daisy also mentioned how she had a bruise on her finger. I don't want to confuse you. I don't think that Tom physically abuses Daisy at all, but we know that he was a powerful end playing football in college, and we know that he's got this immense physical strength. And so, Daisy kind of calls him a brute. But again, he doesn't, and I don't think he would ever do that to his wife Daisy, but he feels like he can do it here to Myrtle. Again, I think amplifying that notion that he views her as something that's disposable, like trash, like I'll use her for as long as I want and then toss her out. But I think that this moment is important because it communicates to us that Daisy still occupies an untouchable position in Tom's life. Yeah, he's willing to cheat on her, which is completely wrong, but he's still, I think, protective of her. He doesn't want anyone else, especially someone of Myrtle's low position, speaking ill of Daisy. And so I think that communicates something about his relationship to Daisy. So important moment there. All right. And then basically this chapter ends with Nick waiting for the 4 a.m. train to go back to Long Island. These people didn't do a lot of sleeping and did a lot of drinking and partying. All right, so that's it for this chapter.